There are places in this world where the membrane between the past and the present has been worn thin by the weight of tragedy. There are locations where the soil itself seems saturated with the adrenaline of the condemned and the blood of the guilty. We often like to think of history as something confined to books, locked away in museums, or buried beneath 6 feet of earth. But there are exceptions. There are structures that function less like buildings and more like batteries, storing centuries of pain, terror, and injustice, waiting for the right moment to discharge that energy into the living. You are listening to Nocturnal Ledger. Today, we are opening a file that has been accumulating darkness for over 900 years. This is not a campfire tale. This is a journey into one of the most documented, historically violent, and scientifically baffling locations in the United Kingdom. We are traveling to the shadow of the Holy Mountain in Wales, to a place where the rope still swings in the corner of the eye, and where the dead do not merely whisper, they scream. This is the story of the Skirrid Mountain Inn. To understand the sheer magnitude of the haunting at the Skirrid, one must first come to terms with its age. We are not talking about a Victorian manor or a colonial farmhouse. The foundations of this inn were laid in the year 1110, that is the early 12th century. The Norman conquest was still fresh in the minds of the people. It was a time of brutal feudal law, of sword and shield, where life was cheap and death was often agonizing. For over 9 centuries, this building has stood in Llanfihangel Crwcorni, watching the seasons turn, watching kings rise and fall, and watching generation after generation of patrons walk through its doors. But for many of those patrons, the Skirrid Mountain Inn was not a place of rest or refreshment. It was the last place they would ever see. The geography itself suggests a tier in the natural order. The inn sits in the shadow of Skirrid Fawr, known as the Holy Mountain. According to local legend, the mountain split in two at the exact moment of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. A geological scar formed by a theological trauma. Whether or not you believe the religious lore, the geological reality is that the inn sits upon ancient, shifting earth, a place that has been considered sacred and cursed in equal measure since the Bronze Age. But the true horror of the Skirrid is not in the rock and stone outside, but in the wood and beam inside. For centuries, this was not merely a pub. It served as a courtroom. In the days before centralized justice, local inns often doubled as places of judgment, and the Skirrid had a reputation. It was a place where the gavel came down heavy and fast. Documentation suggests that the ground floor was used to hold the trials. The accused would stand before the magistrate, trembling, sweating, begging for their lives. And when the verdict was guilty, which it so often was, they did not have to travel far for their punishment. They did not go to a town square or a distant gallows field. The sentence was carried out immediately, right there, in the stairwell. Look closely at the architecture of the staircase in the Skirrid Mountain Inn today. You will see a structural feature that chills the blood of even the most hardened skeptics. There is a beam, an ancient, solid piece of oak, running across the ceiling of the stairwell. If you examine the wood, you can see the scorch marks. You can see the grooves worn into the timber. These are not decorative. These are the friction burns of rope. Documented historical records indicate that at least 180 people were hanged from that beam. 180 necks snapped, 180 souls forcibly ejected from their bodies in a spasm of violence. Right in the center of the building where people now sit and drink, the most infamous figure associated with this bloody history is Judge George Jeffreys. In the late 17th century, following the Monmouth Rebellion, Jeffreys earned the moniker the Hanging Judge. He was a man of terrifying volatility, known for his red-faced rages, his heavy drinking, and his sadistic delight in sending men to their deaths. While the bloody assizes are most famous for their tour of the West Country, local lore and historical footnotes place Jeffreys or his immediate subordinates at the Skirrid, dispensing capital punishment with the efficiency of a butcher. It is said that he would sit in the main room, consuming vast quantities of alcohol, while the bodies of the men he had just condemned swung in the stairwell mere yards away. The air would have been thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale ale, and the copper tang of blood. It is this atmosphere, this heavy, suffocating blanket of misery, that seems to have never left the building. Witnesses who enter the Skirrid Mountain Inn today often report an immediate physical reaction. It is not just a feeling of being watched, which is common in many alleged hauntings. This is visceral. Visitors describe a sensation of heaviness in the chest, a difficulty in drawing breath, as if the oxygen in the room has been displaced by something else. Many have reported the sudden onset of nausea or dizziness, specifically when standing near the staircase. But the most terrifying physical manifestation is the sensation of the noose. This is where the Skirrid separates itself from standard ghost stories. There is a recurring, documented phenomenon known as the Strangulation Effect. Over the last 50 years, dozens of individuals ranging from casual tourists to hardened paranormal investigators and even skeptics have reported the sensation of a rope being tightened around their necks. This is not a vague feeling of tightness. Victims describe the distinct texture of rough hemp. They feel the pressure point behind the ear where the knot would be. They feel the crushing weight on the trachea. In several terrifying instances, this phenomenon has left physical evidence. There are photographs, taken by reputable investigators, showing distinct red welts appearing on the necks of witnesses within minutes of them entering the stairwell. These marks often resemble the burn of a rope, wrapping horizontally around the throat. In one harrowing account, a woman visiting the inn began to claw at her own neck, gasping for air, her face turning purple, as if she were being hoisted up by an invisible hand. Her friends had to physically drag her out of the building before she could breathe again. When they examined her neck in the sunlight of the parking lot, the red abrasions were clearly visible, fading only after hours had passed. What kind of energy is required to manifest physical force strong enough to bruise human tissue? We are not talking about a residual recording of the past. We are talking about an active, aggressive intelligence that remembers the method of execution and seeks to replicate it. But the hanging judge and his victims are not the only entities said to walk these creaking floorboards. The inn is a layered cake of history, and each century has added its own stratum of ghosts. There is the tragic story of Fanny Price. Unlike the criminals and rebels hanged in the stairwell, Fanny was a resident of the inn in the 18th century. She worked there, lived there, and ultimately died there of consumption or tuberculosis. Her death was slow, agonizing, a gradual drowning in her own fluids. Witnesses in the upper rooms, specifically room 2 and room 3, often report a drastic drop in temperature. It is the kind of cold that sinks into the bone, defying the central heating of the modern age. Accompanying this cold is often the smell. It is not the smell of rot, but the scent of lavender and old herbs, the kind used to mask the odor of sickness in the 18th century. Guests who have stayed overnight in these rooms report waking up to see the figure of a woman standing at the foot of the bed. She does not scream or attack. She simply watches, her expression one of profound sadness and confusion. However, her presence is often accompanied by the sound of racking, wet coughing echoing from empty corners of the room. It is a heartbreaking reminder that not all ghosts are monsters. Some are merely memories of suffering that the building refuses to let go. Then there is the entity known as the White Lady, sometimes conflated with Fanny Price but often described as distinct, perhaps dating back even further to the medieval origins of the site. She is often seen drifting through the bar area or ascending the stairs. But unlike the passive Fanny, the energy in the bar can be violent. This brings us to the poltergeist activity. Poltergeist, meaning noisy ghost, is a term often thrown around loosely, but at the Skirrid, the activity fits the definition perfectly. Bartenders and landlords over the decades have reported a litany of impossible occurrences. Heavy beer glasses have been seen sliding across the table of their own volition before smashing onto the floor. Coins thrown into the wishing well, a feature of the inn, have been thrown back out at patrons with considerable force. There is a chaotic, angry energy that seems to resent the presence of the living. One former landlady gave a chilling testimony regarding the bar area. She claimed that late at night, after the customers had gone and the doors were locked, she would hear the distinct sound of a gavel striking wood, followed by the murmur of many voices. It sounded like a courtroom in session. When she would enter the room to investigate, the sounds would cease instantly, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. But the glasses on the shelf would be vibrating, clinking together as if the room itself were trembling from the aftershocks of the spectral trial. We must also consider the documented visitations by high-profile paranormal investigation teams. The Skirrid Mountain Inn has been subjected to scrutiny by researchers from all over the world. During one investigation, a medium attempted to communicate with the spirit of the hanging judge. The response was not a whisper, but a violent reaction. Equipment began to malfunction. Fully charged batteries drained to zero in seconds, a common sign of spirits drawing energy to manifest. But more disturbingly, the medium was physically pushed, stumbling back as if shoved by a large, angry man. An electronic voice phenomenon, or EVP, captured during this session, recorded a deep, guttural voice. When the audio was cleaned and amplified, the voice seemed to be shouting a single command: "Get out." The evidence is not limited to the audio. There is visual documentation of shadow figures, dense, black masses, that block out the ambient light moving through the corridors. These are not tricks of the light or pareidolia. These shadows move with purpose. They have been seen ducking into doorways, peering over banisters, and standing behind patrons in mirrors. One particularly disturbing photograph taken by a guest shows a dark, nebulous shape hovering near the infamous hanging beam. The shape does not resemble a human so much as a mass of static, a chaotic knot of negative energy. Skeptics, of course, have tried to debunk the Skirrid. They point to the power of suggestion. They argue that if you tell someone a place is haunted by a hanging judge, their mind will manufacture the sensation of choking. They point to the infrasound caused by the wind rushing down off the Skirrid Mountain, creating low-frequency vibrations that can cause feelings of dread and hallucinations. These are valid scientific theories. However, they fail to explain the physical marks. Infrasound cannot leave a welt on a human neck. Suggestion cannot cause a heavy glass to fly horizontally across a room and shatter against a wall. The sheer volume of consistent, corroborating testimony from people who had no prior knowledge of the inn's history suggests that there is something objectively real occurring within these stone walls. We must also look at the darker, more predatory aspect of the hauntings. There are reports of a specific entity in the bathroom area, a presence that feels distinctly male and sexually aggressive. Female guests have reported feeling hands on their waist or hearing whispered obscenities in their ear when they are alone. This aligns with the historical reality of the inn. For centuries, this was a place of rough men, soldiers, and criminals. It is naive to think that only the victims of the hangings remain. The perpetrators, the drunkards, the violent men who frequented the inn in life may also be bound to it in death. The Skirrid is not just a repository for the sad. It is a cage for the wicked. The current owners and staff of the Skirrid Mountain Inn live a life of uneasy truce with these forces. They speak of the ghosts not as distant legends, but as troublesome roommates. They know which rooms to avoid after dark. They know that when the temperature drops suddenly, it is time to leave a specific area. But even they admit that there are nights when the atmosphere shifts from mischievous to malignant. Nights when the shadows seem to lengthen, and the air grows thick with the anticipation of violence. One of the most disturbing accounts comes from a former landlord who witnessed what he described as a replay of a hanging. He was closing up for the night, turning off the lights in the main bar. As he looked toward the staircase, he saw a body. It was not a translucent ghost, but a solid-looking figure, suspended in the air, twitching. The landlord froze, his mind trying to process the impossibility of what he was seeing. He described the sound of the rope creaking, the wet sound of the man gasping for air. And then, in the blink of an eye, the figure was gone. The stairwell was empty, but the beam was swinging slightly, as if the weight had just been released. This concept of the stone tape theory is often applied to the Skirrid. The idea is that the quartz and limestone in the building's structure have recorded the high-stress events of the past, replaying them when the atmospheric conditions are right. This might explain the sounds of the courtroom or the repetitive coughing of Fanny Price. But it does not explain the interaction. A recording cannot scratch you. A recording cannot tighten a noose around your throat. The Skirrid seems to host both residual hauntings, mere echoes of the past, and intelligent hauntings, entities that are aware of the living and capable of interacting with them. There is also a connection to the rebellion of Owain Glyndŵr in the early 15th century. The inn was said to be a rallying point for the Welsh forces. The violence of that era, the bloody skirmishes and the brutal reprisals by the English crown, adds another layer of blood to the soil. It is as if the land itself is addicted to conflict. The Skirrid Mountain Inn stands as a monument to this history of resistance and retribution. Every pint poured is poured over the memory of a war. Every step taken on the flagstones is a step on a grave. Consider the psychological toll on those who visit. Many leave the inn feeling drained, exhausted, as if their own life force has been siphoned off. This is a common report in places of deep trauma. The entities, whatever they are, require energy to manifest. They draw it from the electrical grid, from batteries, and from the bioelectrical field of human beings. To visit the Skirrid is to offer yourself up as a battery for the dead. You are feeding the history, allowing it to remain strong, to remain vibrant. In recent years, the inn has become a pilgrimage site for those obsessed with the macabre. But it is crucial to remember that this is not a theme park. The danger is real. The documented cases of physical assault by unseen forces should serve as a warning. When you walk under that beam in the staircase, you are walking through a portal of execution. You are standing in the exact coordinates where hundreds of men soiled themselves in terror and died in agony. That kind of energy does not simply dissipate. It saturates the wood. It stains the air. Let us return to the specifics of the hanging beam. Forensic analysis of the wood has confirmed its age and the wear patterns consistent with ropes, but there are also deep gouges, believed to be from the heels of the dying men as they kicked out in their final death spasms, their boots scraping against the timber in a desperate, futile attempt to find purchase. Imagine the sound. The scrape of leather on wood, the snap of the neck, the silence that follows. Now imagine that sound replaying, over and over, for 300 years. That is the soundtrack of the Skirrid Mountain Inn. There is a room known as the Evans Room, named after a former licensee. It is one of the most active hotspots in the building. Guests here have reported waking up to find their bedclothes pulled off, or seeing a dark figure sitting in the chair by the window, smoking a pipe. The smell of pipe tobacco is a frequent occurrence, appearing and disappearing in an instant. This ghost is believed to be a former owner, keeping a watch over his property. He seems less malevolent than the entities in the stairwell, but his presence is no less disturbing. It reinforces the idea that the inn claims everyone eventually. The judges, the victims, the owners, the servants. Once you are part of the Skirrid's history, you never truly leave. The terrifying reality of the Skirrid Mountain Inn is that it defies a single explanation. It is not just a ghost story. It is a convergence of history, geology, and tragedy. It is a place where the rules of reality are suspended. The sheer volume of documentation, the police reports, the medical examinations of neck injuries, the thousands of witness testimonies, creates a body of evidence that is impossible to ignore. You can choose to believe that it is all mass hysteria. You can tell yourself that the red marks are psychosomatic. You can dismiss the flying glasses as tremors in the earth. But if you ever find yourself in Llanfihangel Crucorni on a dark Welsh night, and you decide to step through the heavy oak doors of the Skirrid, remember this. You are not entering an empty room. You are entering a crowded courtroom. The trial is still in session. The judge is still watching. And the rope is always ready. The past is not dead. It isn't even past. It is waiting in the shadows of the stairwell, waiting for the warmth of a living body to remind it of what it once was. The ledger of the Skirrid Mountain Inn is written in blood, and the ink is still wet. We are just the readers. They are the authors, and they have not finished writing yet. This has been an entry in the Nocturnal ledger. The darkness is vast, and the stories are endless. Sleep well, if you can. The investigation continues.